So I'll speak for my program, because every program department might be different. So man, this is your time to shine. You get to get up there and share the accumulation of blood, sweat, and tears that you have done for however long. Well, maybe just think about my experience. Which when I did my dissertation, I was like thinking about it while I did. So maybe that was thinking about that. But the effort that you put in to being able to do this is phenomenal, right? And so take up the space. I know that for me, a lot of times I felt very worried of me. I was going to know the parameters with what you're doing, but you get to get up there and share your journey. And that's really wonderful. And take up the space, I think, is one of the things I would say. I would also just say, like, logistically and practically, again, because that's also how I think about these things. Make sure you know what elements you do need to cover in your dissertation proposal. Like, I've been to some where they don't even talk about literature. And in my program, you have to be able to ground yourself in the literature that you're getting the PhD program in, right? You have to be able to think about, explain your methods and your approach and the question. And also for my field, this learners, so what? So what? And why is that important? The one thing I will say I often see too, is that people often don't want to talk about the strengths or the weaknesses of their approach, because they're so worried that will shine a light on maybe something that was problematic, when in reality, there are always strengths and weaknesses to our approach. And that's part of you're in conversation with others to help them understand how you might see that and to be able to talk about that. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your work, right? It just shows where others then might come in and pick up, or you might pick that up again in like a future kind of project that you will do. And I know that in my dissertation, again, program specific, I like knowing what's going to happen next for that person. Like, the dissertation is only one part of the journey. And that took a long time for me to understand. I thought it was the only journey, right? Because I was like, I need to get this sucker done. But in reality, it is just a sucker, right? And so how will this inform and influence what's going to happen next? And so those are kind of my tips about when you're thinking about what to prepare, both in terms of content, but also like how to embrace the space while you do that.
Also, the so what is important, I think, for every discipline. Like, no one is going to be interested if you're like, I'm going to talk about this really niche thing that I have been really pouring myself into, but then I commit no effort to explain why anyone else should be interested in it. Like, you might have like gone down a real rabbit hole with it, and like sometimes you will, and that's like totally okay.
Yeah.
But if you don't emphasize why other people should care, like early on, and then like bring it back to that at the end, then people will like tune out right away. So the so what, I think, is important for like any presentation you ever give, especially if you're trying to showcase, and you are, like, all of this work that you did, you should convey to people why they should care about all of that work that you did.
Can I add one other thing? So I also say, like, I was may not seem like it, but I was very much an introvert about my research and very shy about it and quiet about it. And so when they said it was going to be a public event, I was like, hold on, I will do the bare minimum to share this because I feel so kind of quiet about my work. And I think that's a mistake. I would say your program and department will do some things to like market that the event is happening, but also take that on yourself as part of your dissertation proposal defense to be able to share that work, because it's a rare opportunity to bring people together from different parts of the university, different parts of your research community, different parts of your personal life to be able to share the work that you did. And I think that marketing stuff, and I'm just thinking about something right now, I think always gets kind of short shrift.
Yes, I had some.
Absolutely.
When you do your presentation, all your work done, you have a lot done, and you love a lot of those things because you put a lot of your heart into it, and there's a lot of cool stuff in there, and you have only so much time to talk about it, and you have people that want to introduce this thing, and then there may be, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 minutes for sharing the results and the importance of what it is. So you have to really limit yourself into what is the thing that you actually want to do. So you cannot talk about all the work that you have done or all the cool interests that that's what I said with a story. What is really, why is this thing important that you've done? And then everything should line up to that. And those things that don't really support this one thing, they have to go. They might be part of another paper or something else, or you talk about it at a different time. But for that event, you have one message to bring. That is what you want to support.
And master's theses you'll have that like a little more obviously or logically, because normally you focus kind of on one thing for a master's thesis. So you might not have as much stuff that you're like, oh, okay, you probably have a pretty coherent story. For me, and like at least for the like PhD students that I have had, you probably have worked on like multiple different projects, and you're like, what the hell is the theme for this? Like, you don't even like. It's hard to even string together the different things, but you do have to come up with some sort of story. You know, so like you have to have it all stitched together and like narrow it down and pitch it as like a coherent story that people can follow.
And that's like, I mean, I actually really love the advice that I just heard, because in essence, one of the tricks I used to do when I was preparing for my defense was I asked my friends what they thought my friends or colleagues that I had when I was prepping, I asked them what they thought my theme was. And then I would match it with what I thought my theme would be like. Oh, and then I need to do some work on how to explain or align that better. And I think this is like a total natural thing. You become such an expert in what you're doing. You get into your expert head and speak, and it's hard to think about how to translate that to like a broader kind of audience. I really like what both of you just said there.
Excellent. You guys just fit into my next two questions. So we'll yeah, good question. Go ahead.
No, that was more like a comment. I think about the defense more so in terms of I'm explaining this to people who don't really know anything about it. I mean, at home I'm practicing on my husband and everyone who works in the house. But I feel like I need to give enough high level information with review framework and not like spend like 20 minutes explaining all of that. Because I only have an hour, I'll be running out of time if I would put a great focus on the lit review. I mean, to me it's about the results. What did my analysis show?
That depends on each discipline. It'll be different, but like I'll say that's why like in my department when we have visiting speakers come in, a lot of times it's like if I give a presentation to another department, I do spend like 20 minutes on background to make sure people have that sort of foundation that they can then understand what I'm telling them. Because not everyone is an expert talking about, but you are right then, like it does limit how much you can actually present of the rest of your work. And so what Peter's saying, like you have to have like a story that you know how everything's flowing, because you do have to spend time with the background. If you like jip yourself on the background, then it's sort of lost on everyone, like what you're doing. So you always do have to have that, but an exact amount and how you present depends on, I would say, each discipline.
Because it's an extension of your, in my world, a dissertation or articles, right? And so there are a very small group of people who have reviewed that for very fine-grained data, right? Because they're the ones that are guiding the feedback and making sure you make those kinds of standards, right? And this is just an opportunity to present it in a different forum to a different set of voters or different.
I don't know what areas you are, but whatever you do, it is related to this world. It is somehow in response to a big issue that we have on this planet. And that might be a good starting point. And one starting point to get in there is find something that's in use. Something come out of the White House, whatever it is, that you say, okay, actually, that is part of why I do my work. So start with that part. And that will bring in, you get the attention of the audience is doing that. Tie it to something which is important to everybody in the room. And then go into your lit review a little bit later than that. But you start with the big picture. Why is this thing important? Matters to people that are here.
Other questions?
And it's kind of like the same question of how to bridge that gap between the higher level of technology, knowing like your business committee wants, and then the problems in the groups.
I honestly feel like the committee doesn't always need to be like that presentation, because it is your like public presentation. It's meant to be geared towards a different audience. At least this is my opinion. I mean, like, maybe it's different in various disciplines, but like, this is your public presentation. So this is meant to be how you're explaining that to educated non-specialists. Whereas like what you're writing in your actual thesis, in your actual dissertation, that could be super technical. That's going to people who should have expertise in what you did your research on. But yeah, that public presentation, like, don't feel that you need to like invest a huge amount of time in some like really nitty gritty detail that then everyone who brings other than your committee is going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about there. So it's, yeah, there's sort of two different audiences if you're hearing a written document versus your like public world.
That's like the translatability of your work, right? Like you should be able to pitch it in a variety of different contexts, right? You should be able to do the elevator speech. You should be able to do, because I think about a conference presentation. You should be able to do something for your classmates in your college. You should be able to do something that's, you know, what we're talking about here in terms of a much longer kind of defense, right? And I mean, it's both. I'm gonna act like it's frustrating, right? Because you're trying to figure out how to curate it to those different audiences. But I would say that just by the very fact that you're asking that question, that shows that you are on the right path. Right, you're trying to figure out with that time, and it's so funny because I think of an elevator speech as like a pretty short amount of time, but like your dissertation, you actually do get a fair amount of time to be able to talk about your work and to provide enough, you know, coverage to be able to show your line of thinking. There's a difference between, and I use this sort of how many, you know, Steph Witt is wonderful and she's in my program. It's the difference between showing how you parked your car and showing the mechanics inside the car, the engine, right? And so there's different levels of specificity that you need to get at different points. And again, and I think like it's the extension of other work that you already doing. But for me, and I think it's really, and again, I think about the program as a whole, making sure that you have covered the stuff that your program and your chair wants you to cover. Like doing that in tandem, that is also a kind of mentorship that your chair should also be providing you, as well with the head foundation program in my case.
Any other questions on that topic before we pivot to kind of the next phase here? All right. So the next question I'll throw out here for the panel is, now you've survived that public presentation, and now you have to face the firing squad, and you have to open it up for questions. So how do you handle constructive criticism, difficult questions that you might face after your defenses, after you've survived the presentation portion?
Well, I think the public thing, there should not be criticism, but it's the public. So you first have the room that asks questions, not the committee. That the committee will ask you then later in a closed session. And that's where the firing really goes. But in the public discussion, there are questions. I think starting with framing the question back to the audience is a good way to start, so that many who are there might not really understand what the question is or in what context it was asked. So if you can reframe that, that gives you time to think about it while you do that. And the direct answer, I think, is very often you don't have it. There's a question where you don't know what the real result is, but you can talk about it and around it and say, okay, the question refers to these and these things, and from my work, I have answered part of that in this way, and I could see that in the next study we would go on in this way about answering that particular question, and in this way you show you know what the context is. You can show how your work refers to the question, and also that you see that this is not the end of the day, but go for the future.
So I love the Q&A portion for both of them, actually, because it gives you another chance to talk more about your work, right? Like that's really great. One of the strategies that I used was like, I would ask a colleague of mine or a friend, like, if you feel comfortable, ask me a question, like in that public presentation, right? Like, I think that's not a bad strategy Either just an easy question like that. Well, when they think it's interesting or connected to their work, right? They know what you've been, that kind of journey that you've been on, like that's not, I think that's totally appropriate to do. And in my experience, like 9.9 times out of 10, people are coming from a place of generosity and curiosity when they ask those questions. So do your best to not feel scared, or wondering what's going to happen in that part. And that's totally human to do that way, but do your best to try to realize it's just another opportunity for you to talk about your work. And the other thing, again, I'm an over prepper. Like, imagine what kind of questions people are going to give you in advance, or that you think that might pick up, and here are a couple of bullet points about how you might answer them. So I think that's something that I would recommend that you do. And then also, don't apologize. I think is something else I would say that I, see sometimes that people apologize for something that they didn't, like to say, oh, that's like a really interesting question. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk more about that portion of my research, rather than like, I'm so sorry I didn't talk about that in my dissertation. It's just more space to be able to do that. And again, it means that people were listening to what you were presenting. Like, I mean, that's a great thing that people are asking us to do.
And I do think it's okay to also admit that you don't know something. I had a class in graduate school where we were supposed to become experts on the topic and present them to the class. And the two professors that taught the class, I think their goal was to get you to the point where you would admit that you didn't know something. Like they wanted to test that you did your background research on this topic you were presenting, but also that eventually you got to the point where they were asking you some really difficult questions that you probably didn't know the answer to. And some people would try to like lie or just talk endlessly and like hope that they were eventually going to answer the question. But they really wanted people to just say something like, well, thank you for that question. I haven't thought of that, or I'll have to look into that, or I just don't know. I didn't consider that, or that was outside the scope of this work that I did, or like, things that show like, oh, that was, a good question. Like, thanks for asking something like that. But I don't know the answer. I mean, and you might feel really uncomfortable doing that, but like, hopefully you've had professors that will actually do that in class. That's like the scariest thing about being a professor is when you first start teaching that students will ask you questions you won't know the answer to. And after a while, you're like, oh, no, that's fine. I just don't know the answer to that question. It's okay to not know the answer to every question. Sometimes people will ask you like totally weird things in your defenses. And you're like, that was an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to look into it more. Like, it is okay to sort of admit things like that. Don't like freak out if you don't know the answers. Okay.
I also agree with I think it's the most fun part is the Q&A. And you can prepare for that in your presentation. In a way that you hear the presentation such that it is actually received by the audience. And that means you don't talk to your supervisor in the room with the content and all the specific, but really make it accessible with the breadth and the motivation that comes in and just showing what the meaning of this actually is, or beyond just the science. Well, that will help the audience to ask questions. The other thing is, when I hear an hour, I think typically an hour is the public session. So that includes the introduction, that includes the Q&A. So talk to your supervisor. I tell my students, if you talk half an hour, that's good. I want to have you not long, but if you have to go 40 minutes, but then I want to have you dead silent after that, and you need to give room to the Q&A after that. So because this is an important part in the entire thing, and I think after 40 minutes, most of the audience is just tired.
I think the other thing is if it gives you a chance to explain your choices. Also, like when people like the questions that you may not know, sometimes I reframe the question and be like, yeah, I can understand like why that would be like a really interesting area. I went in this direction because of X, Y, and Z, so they can see the logic behind your choices. And I get that question all the time, right? Like, how come you looked at this and not at this, right? And I don't think it comes from a place of like a gotcha moment. I think you're honestly just, try to imagine that people are curious about your choices. And there's ways of saying, well, I don't know. There's ways of saying, I went in this direction because of X, Y, or Z. There's a way of saying, you know, there's actually other people that really study it, and I'd be happy to give you the sources if you're thinking of that more, or it's a future area that I might consider going into with my work. So you have a menu of options in terms of like how you respond to those kinds of questions.
Any questions from students on that front? So in contrast, then, as you say, that's true. I mean, for the open public presentation, especially if you're looking at a general audience, do you use that situation to prepare for the closed door session? Is that completely different? I mean, give us not recognizing that it's different for each of your departments as far as how you go about it. But can you just kind of give us an overview of what a student might expect once they've transitioned into that closed door piece?
I feel like the closed door part is normally more technical because it's based on both your presentation, but also the written document you provided to your committee. And so a lot of times I've found that like we'll have read the written document before we get there. Your committee members should do that. Some people are like, oh, I'll read it later. They really should have read it before you have your oral defense. And so they should have read it. And then a lot of times they'll be like, I actually really like the way that you explained that to a general audience. Like if you did a good job, they'll say, maybe it needs some more work in how you wrote it this technical way, but the way you explained it generally was really good. Or they might say the technical one's really good, but your general one, that was way over people's heads. Like you need to work on that. So it's a little bit different because it is based on both your written document, which is geared to a different audience, and that big general presentation. But normally it seems to, at least in like geosciences, it normally is mostly I had just some like questions about this. So yeah, like why did you make that decision where you use this one method when there should be other methods to do that too? Like, can you explain why you did that? Or yeah, can you explain why that research is impactful? So it's sort of like following up maybe on some like loose threads you had, or just wanting you to be able to convey that information in multiple different ways. So it normally is not in like, it's not an attack. And people often will be like, oh, this is going to be really scary. It's not really meant to be like an attack. It is meant at that point, if you and your advisor, or what you say, like your supervisory committee chair, whatever you call that person, if you have been in communication and you both agreed that you were ready for your defense, it really is a time where they are treating you more like a colleague, that they have questions for you about what you did. And it's not really like critiquing you, it's more just question and answer, just like, oh, well, why did you do that specific thing? They are looking at you as an expert at that point too. And so you shouldn't feel like it's going to be this like attack. It seems to more be a conversation. And normally it's like all the committee members will get involved, and it actually is more of a conversation than just like back and forth.
I remember when I did mine, I didn't get asked a single question. My committee members asked each other questions. And I was like, wait, I'm here, I swear to God. I don't think that's the way it's supposed to go. But at the same time, I know, right? They saw the work I was doing, engaging with their work. And so they were, and so I think I mentioned that because I don't think that there is a copy and paste approach to what happens in that session. It'll depend on so many different kinds of factors and what they draw on. So something that maybe one of your colleagues experienced may be different than what you experienced in terms of what the approach was in the Q&A. And that's totally obviously fine with balance, right? And but I completely agree that they'll get into the fine-tune issues within that document. And chances are what they'll be talking about there might be connected to some slight provisions they want you to make if you do pass, right? And so in my mind, take good notes while you are going through that Q&A process, so then you can go back and quickly get those done if you do pass and move forward. Like that would be really important. And then share that out with that committee. Be like, thank you for the private Q&A session today. These are the things I took away. And then I would follow up again after I revise the dissertation or 3 articles and say, this is how I address those topics that you had from the Q&A portion, if there are any.
When I'm in the closed session and I'm the supervisor, the committee chair, I feel a lot of ownership. Therefore, I feel like I'm actually here being investigated as much as my student. And I feel like I'm nervous about that also. So there's other committee members that actually now are judging my students' work, but this is also hopefully also my work in there that we put together over a number of years in there. So that maybe also maybe just a thought. So you're not alone in there. It's a conversation, but your supervisor is super interested in you succeeding in that moment. And so what this means is that also in preparation, your supervisor is interested in having you well prepared. And so when you think about, well, whenever your defense is, when a student comes to me and regarding their readiness is, well, I tell them, you know what, there's the defense date. I want your committee to have at least 2 weeks, if not 3 weeks, to read your thesis. And the thesis that you give to them, that needs to be the polished piece. And we need to polish this up together. And I take about 2 weeks per round. I want to go use 3 times through this process. So that adds another 6 weeks. So you have now more than 2 months before your defense that you have to have your full draft ready. That means you need to start writing about this another 3 months before then. So almost half a year is when you actually start thinking, okay, I defend in September, so now is the time to actually get started. And then is in this process of this writing and rewriting, you really hone in what is the essence of your work. And so don't think about this as a thing that, oh, I've in 2 weeks I can write 2 pages per day, and so well I should have 70, 100 or however many pages. That's how many days I need. I get this done and then I'm done. No, then it's when it starts, right? You need to revise things. You might revise chapter by chapter, or however you do that. This your supervisor, and out of that work, you go into the defense and are ready to then talk about what you have to show.
I'll say if you have a really poorly written final document, the closed door portion is going to be a lot harder than if you put like care into, like you've not given them like here's a rough draft. You have to make sure it's been edited, it's good. Because yeah, if you give them something that's just like a rough draft, like if I give co-authors a rough draft of my writing, I expect I'm going to get really critical feedback. And I've been writing science for like 15 years now. So like, if you think, well, I'm just going to give them all a rough draft, then that might be a harder closed door portion because they're focused on your writing and the fact that your writing might not be as clear as it should be and not telling as good of a story and as clear of a story. So like make sure it's something good that goes in there. So it's more or less like discussion and less like this is stuff you're really going to need to fix.
A couple of thoughts I had there. One is, remember that the faculty members that you're working with have a lot of responsibilities, right? And so when you're going through that work, you are all in on that work, and it's often like all that you're thinking about or close to it. But they're also juggling a lot, so you have to take into account the time they need to be able to review your work and give you feedback. And one of the best things to do there, if it hasn't already, it should already happen, right? Like, is discussing with your committee chair what that process is actually going to look like and when you can expect feedback. And the hardest part is realizing that you don't get to decide and decide when you're done, right? It's the committee that does, particularly your supervisory chair. And so giving them the tools in order to help you get to that stage is like really important. And that's why, like I mentioned earlier, have some really clear deadlines and guidelines about who's going to get to see what when, so there are no surprises, and it can take away some of the stress and anxiety that come with seeing that defense goal.
So even if question like this, that if there are multiple approaches or tools, and what is it to select this particular approach? Is it okay to answer that? This is what I like did. This is provided by my supervisor, or this is what I got here in this. So is it okay, or just vague?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine to say like, yeah, this was what I was supposed to be focusing on for my research. And if you're aware of other approaches, it's helpful to then say why you were using that particular approach. Like your supervisor, they had some reason for you to use that approach. Like they sent you down that road for a reason. And hopefully it was not because they thought it would fail. Like they thought there were better things out there. Normally it's because like they think that that was a good approach for you to use. And so you should be aware of if there are other ways that you could accomplish the same goals out there. And say, well, yeah, this was, I was tasked with this, but this is why that makes sense as well. So yes, it's sort of okay to say it was your advisor steering that, but also you should know why they like steered you towards that activity.
And I think like just to pick up on that, what I really like about what you were saying there is, and again, I don't like driving, so all my analogies today are about roads and cars and all that other stuff, so forgive me, but like in my program, the dissertation proposal, everybody signed off on that. And that's your map, right? That's your roadmap. And you can say, well, like when we were designing this project at this particular place, this is the approach we took. And if you ever had to veer from that dissertation proposal, like in my case, like you talked about it with your committee chair and like brought everybody into the loop about why that happened, because that sometimes happens, right? Like I know mine changed dramatically based on like what happened to the data I thought I was allowed to collect and then what I ended up having to collect. And so I think it's completely fine to explain the choices that you've made and why. And like I think like a lot of people just care that there was thought that went into the choices of what you did. And I think that's an, give yourself the time and space to be able to share that. A great question.
All right, I have kind of one final section, and I know Dr. Ashley, you touched on it just briefly here. Is inevitably after that, is in my role, as I see the dissertations and theses come in post defense, there's always a little bit of changes that you're asked for. Do you guys have any tips as to how to handle that portion? I know most students, it's fairly minor. Every once in a while, I'll get a student who'll come in and tell me that they're really having to negotiate with their committee or their chair. Typically, how does that process go when you have to make some of those minor changes?
I would say make sure you're working with your primary supervisor, your advisor, because you might have someone on the committee that like went crazy and they didn't like your writing style or something like that. And so they might have tons of things and they're like, I would move this to here and this to here and this to here and do all of this and rephrase these things. And the supervisor might be like, yeah, you could do it that way, but that's not any different, like any better than the way that you have it right now. So make sure that you're talking to them, because then they ultimately would be the person that then goes back to the committee. It's like, when you say, all right, now here's my final version. If a committee member is like, hey, you didn't implement every single thing that I recommended you do, you should be able to justify that. And your supervisor should be there to support that. They should then say, yeah, I didn't think they needed to do that either. And so we collectively decided that that wasn't necessary. So yeah, talking to them is sort of critical, making sure what you're submitting is okay with everyone and that they're willing to say, no, you don't need to do everything that everyone on the committee said.
I mentioned earlier that good strategy for this is to get like a R&R. Is anything about an R&R? Revised and submit like journal article. And so I take notes from the defense. I compile those with any other notes I got from the committee. And then I submit a separate document that explains how I address them and where you can find that in that, what you hope is the final revision of your document. And that way, it's a really clear, concise, and transparent way that you are showing how you thoughtfully addressed what you did. And you can say there are some things that you didn't do and explain why. That doesn't mean that they're not going to come back unless you still do them, right? But just like know that that is part of the process. And like I just wouldn't treat the defense as like a draft, right? Like and I think Peter alluded to this earlier, that it should be very minor changes, if any, that have to like move forward on that. And so I think that sometimes like where some of the confusion happens, like you think, well, I've successfully passed my defense. Why do I have to do any more work on the dissertation? And so being really clear that is not the case, right? That those are connected, that there are different expectations, like in terms of like what next is really important. I would also just say the grace that you want to give the graduate college, right? Because like the mark that you're trying to hit is to give them, so like at one point we hand off and we say, our part is done. But the graduate college has a very lean staff that's trying to review all the dissertations and pre-articles that are coming through to get them to the standard of what the university will accept and approve. And that is no small feat. And so just know that they are handling that kind of, and that's why those deadlines exist. And I wish they weren't in that situation, that they had more resources to be able to pull it off. But just know they're not trying to be mean. They're not trying to be firm, right? They're doing that because that's just the nature of the system that we have set up here. So do all you can to make sure they don't have to send it back to you, right? And I mean, I think Wayne, maybe you can talk a little bit about what are the biggest things that you see that get people stuck? Because there are people that get stuck, right? Between defending, having a positive experience, and then never getting to that final stage because of that, the last little minute of work that you have to do. And often, like what it felt like for me was senioritis. I felt like I was done, and there's just these like couple of things that are just like folding over my head. And sometimes they actually felt more painful than all of the other work I had to do to get to that point, because you're so close to the finish line. And I think the other piece of advice that I would say is don't give up. Get there. Do those last minute things so that you can get across, and then throw yourself the biggest party ever.
And make sure you know those last minute things will actually take a long time too. Like you're going to spend at least a day, like a full work day of formatting. And I remember with my dissertation, I brought it in, I'm going to bring in a printed copy, and they sat there with a ruler and they measured the margin on every single one of my pages. Like just sat there, and then like the section headers had to be a certain part way down on the page. And they have all these, like every university has to say these very standard, specific university requirements, and they will be checked. And so like do yourself a favor and put the time into doing it. Because I remember sitting there, she's like the margins, and she's like, well, your section headers are all only 2 inches from the top of the page, and they had to be 2 1/4 inches from the top of the page. And then I had to go back in and fix all of that throughout my whole dissertation. And yeah, when you're thinking you're done, that is so painful to have to do. So like be aware that there are like standard formatting requirements and like just like do them.
The index was the bane of my assistant. To this day, I will pay any amount of money to somebody else to do it, but I was before as a graduate student and had to do it myself. And I had the last appointment at the graduate college they offered to me for graduation, and my index blew up the day before and it disappeared, and I had spent a week putting it together. And so
Yeah,
and
remember
then
the landscape pages.
I wanted them to acknowledge all the work I had done to like figure it out, as they brought out the rulers and they could care less, which is fine. But I mentioned the other thing that I don't think that we talk about enough is how to manage your well-being, like during those last little steps. And I think Bradwell is doing that. But like the last little bit, are you like, you got it, Dr. Ashley, or are you like, you're like,
Oh, it's hitting very close to home.
Your well-being is the most important thing. And so make sure you don't skip on that as you're doing these last little few steps, that you do the things that are important to you. I ran every morning with a group of other people that were finishing at the same time. And this is, we call it rage running. And so we would rage run up about those last steps up and down the Schuylkill River. But that's the reason I was able to like not explode. And so that's just the way that I did it. But don't feel like that stuff is not important. That stuff is at the core of being able to take care of yourself as you think this lessons. The rulers are just
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is a little bit more of a logistics paperwork question. I'm defending in March, and I got an email that I have to fill out this defense committee approval form and this access agreement and so on. And I have done those things, I think. But from what I understand, the defense committee approval form is like the hard, like you have to bring a hard copy to your defense and give it off to your committee and make sure that everyone signs it when they're happy with you after your closed door session. But my advisor was also not familiar with what the heck the access agreement is, where like I provided all of the keywords I wanted and gave approval to the university to publish whatever I give them and they approve on site. You clarified how all of that works.
Yeah.
In general.
Hopefully I can do it pretty quickly. You have it exactly right. Your committee approval form basically tells us in the graduate college that your committee signed off that yes, you passed your defense. We are ready to move on to you submitting your thesis for review and jumping through the hoops for graduation. The access agreement, what that does, we have two separate services we use. We use ProQuest ETD, which is the service that I use to go in and review your documents, check all those. I don't use a ruler, but but yeah, I'll go in and look at that. I'll go in and look at your margins. I'll make sure that it's readable. If there's something wonky about it, about your figures or your captions or your table of contents, I mean, we'll go in and clean all that stuff up as much as we can. If it's a bigger project, we'll get a hold of the student and say, hey, we need to fix this here, and we'll work with you on it. And then we also have a repository here in the library called ScholarWorks, which is where your thesis officially lives once it completes the review process. The access agreement is just you giving us permission to put that document into that repository. And then you provide the keywords so that if someone wants to go in and search for your work later on, say you're working with, plants or animals or whatever it is, that person can go in and search for that and yours will pop up when they put in that keyword.
Can I follow?
Yeah, you can.
There with the access agreement. This is something that I stumbled on that I wish I had done differently when I was a PhD student. The access agreement is the students can embargo their work.
They can.
And think this through. And the reason for that is there are some journals, if that's what you want to do with the work, that won't publish something that has been published elsewhere, even if it's through a university system. And the embargo gives you some time to get, not all journals are like that, but some are tricky and it saves you some paperwork. So think through whether you want to choose that option or not. Like if you're thinking about that in terms of your career plans. And can they do it for 1 year or 2 years? You
can do it for up to 2 years and it can be renewed. So the first one's for 2. And then if you need more time than that, you can contact us and roll it over.
And it's not because you don't want anyone to see the work, right? That's not why you embargo. You use it as a strategy for your own career development. So think about that. And also I thought all those weird it's totally fine to ask people questions about what they mean, and you should feel free to reach the grad college or your program director if you have any questions about them, because all universities name them differently, right? And I know that I panicked and I was like, oh my God, we get all the things that you needed so the student can graduate.
Yeah, an embargo is just pushing it back when it's officially published through the university. And that is a good thing to do. I embargoed all of my dissertation stuff by a year because when you go to publish with a journal, if that's what you want to do, they ask, has this been published anywhere else before? And if I had not embargoed it, I would have had to have put down that it had been published somewhere else. My son's actually now going to
One note regarding what's it before regarding the thesis rewriting or corrections. If we depend in March, on March 17 is the final reading approval deadline. So you might want to make sure that the time between your defense and then you have the time actually available to do that.
On my calendar, 4 months. Because you all understand what happens if you don't beat that. Maybe.
I can. So the deadline on the 17th, any student that completes their defense and gives me the paperwork and the actual document that I need on the 17th is eligible to graduate this semester. If you turn it in after that date, you go on our wait list. I do a very good job of trying to get through all of my on-time documents, and I usually have successful at clearing off a couple of wait list documents. But I'll tell you, spring is always my busiest semester. Anybody that doesn't get picked off that wait list gets rolled into summer. So that could very well push your graduation to August. There's some tools I have to hopefully mitigate that blow as far as not enrolling for credit and other things. But ultimately, that is the case. If you miss that deadline, there is a firm possibility that you'll get pushed to whatever the next deadline is, August, December, that next semester. So it is important to hit that deadline. And we have to do it that way. For a while there, we were trying to do late submissions and try to figure out how to do that. And it wasn't tenable with the staff we had. So we treat that as a firm deadline. Like I say, I do my best because I know I want to get students out of here. So if you're a week late, I mean, the chances of you getting out of here a week late are better than if you wait until April. There is a cutoff date in April where it's just no go. You'll slide to the next semester. So it's important to hit that deadline. And if you know you're not going to hit it, email me so that I know that. And then, I mean, I'm still going to, there's still a chance you'll get pushed, but at least if I know you're on my radar, then I can give you a realistic chance of, here's how many documents I have to get through. Here's what my list looks like. Here's your realistic chance. And I can be honest with you and tell you, yeah, you might hear, but more likely you'll end up there and you'll have an idea of what you're getting into. So please don't feel like you're going alone. Always email me and say, hey, this is my situation. Here's my date. Where does that put me? And I'll tell you.
And just so I want to keep protecting the grant.
Yes.
I took up the PhD program, and even if Wayne signs off on your documents, let's say you do get pushed this summer, or you do get pushed, however that works.
Mhm.
They're still not providing the final deciding factor when that stuff gets posted. It's actually with the university like registrar office. So just to like keep that in mind. So really you have 3 targets to hit. And Wayne, if I screw this up, tell me to stop.
Yeah.
But you have to hit your department, right? The final reading authority. Then you have to hit Wayne's target of this is good enough to get published.
Yep.
And then you have to hit the registrar that finally confers.
Yep.
And so those are the 3 big steps, which I didn't realize that happened here. So just know them, to keep those in the back of your mind. And that's when your eyes turn to peas, at least in the case of mine.
Yes. And that we're right at noon here. So that's what I'll leave you with as well, is that it's great to ask questions as far as, how the faculty work and how it goes. If you're in that pea soup, as far as the documents goes, what does this form mean? What does this deadline mean? Where does this go? Who do I talk to? Email me. Don't struggle with that. If you have a content issue, obviously go to your chair, your committee. That's where you're going to apply. But anything else that has to do with how do I go from publishing or getting my document done to graduating, that's my office. So don't feel free to message me, stop by my office, shoot me a call, whatever you need to do to help unstress that, because I can help you navigate that as much as possible. So don't go it alone on that, because that's kind of what I'm here for. So I bet we're at an hour. I want to thank our 3 faculty members for joining us today. That was wonderful. We love it. Yes.
Good luck, you guys. We got this.
Thanks for coming today. And again, I'll reiterate, if you have any questions, email me. Okay.